So one of the big things going around right now is the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh is just exceptionally hard to get into if you're a new player, and I could not agree more. I think that a lot of people, especially in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, have sort of forgotten what it was like to learn how to play the game. And for a lot of people, especially people that have been in the game for a very long time, like you maybe learned at a time when Yu-Gi-Oh was easier, but pretty much from the moment synchros were introduced into the game, the curve on how easy Yu-Gi-Oh is to learn started to get steeper and steeper as time went on. Now, I think one of the big problems and something that Konami really needs to address sooner rather than later is the fact that their flagship software right now, Master Duel, which is supposed to be sort of a bridge to get people interested in the main TCG, doesn't actually do a very good job of getting people prepared for playing actual Yu-Gi-Oh. The fact is that they have a tutorial that teaches you normal summon, tribute summon, teaches you how spells and traps work, and then it teaches you the different summoning mechanics. But then it just sort of drops you into the deep end in terms of learning the rest of it. And none of the solo modes really do a good job of preparing you for what's to come. So I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time trying to help you out with that. If you find any of this interesting, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm itching for more subscribers. Something like 0% of my viewers are subscribers. So let's get into this, right? So for starters, if you're seeing this video, you've probably already done the Master Duel tutorial. If not, go do that. Learn the very basics of how the game is actually played, because I'm not going to go over that in this video. That's not what this video is for. If you're specifically talking about Master Duel, there's a few things that you have to keep in mind. The first being that the competitive ladder is sort of broken up into ranks, and the lower ranks are considered a little bit more casual than the higher ranks. But there are still people in the lower ranks aiming to get to the higher ranks, so they'll be playing really pretty competitively good decks. So regardless of what you're doing, even in the casual matches, you're going to run into a lot of people playing pretty competent decks. Now, there's a few things that you have to take into consideration. The first being is, what type of player are you, okay? And this is going to inform the type of deck that you build moving forward. Let's just go ahead and get this out of the way now. Playing the game is not going to do you much good in terms of learning how to play the game. Unless you are willing to read every single card that is being activated at all times and read every single card in your deck multiple times through and think through the intricate ways that they work together without the help of a guide, then you are going to be sort of stuck, just sort of, banging your head against the wall and hoping that something clicks at some point. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and say that you went and you found a deck list and you're starting to play it. Let's sort of talk about what the different types of decks are. Ultimately, there's only two types of decks, really, but they can be sort of broken down further. So there's control decks and there's combo decks. And control decks and combo decks, there is some overlap. Like the Labyrinth deck has a lot of control aspects, but also has a lot of pretty intricate combos that you can do. So you sort of have to, sometimes you have to sort of bridge the gap and just sort of play both. But control decks aim to sort of stop your opponent from playing the game. Typically, these are the best decks for beginners because of the fact that they don't have very many intricate combos, and you only really need to know the cards that are currently in your hand and what those cards do at any given moment. Heavy trap decks are usually great if you're not very confident in knowing how to sort of execute a complicated combo. And the nice thing about playing something like a trap deck is that a lot of the very heavy combo decks, if you set 5 going second, that still can sometimes be enough, especially if you're playing the correct floodgates, or if you have sort of the correct reads on things, have the right sort of negation to be able to deal with your opponent. So if you're interested in sort of easing your way in, sort of like playing a deck that the whole point is to not really care about what your opponent does, just sort of hit no on a bunch of effects and hope that things go well. Eventually, you have to start learning where to negate, but a lot of times, if you just negate things that seem like they're important, that's usually enough. Now, the second type is combo. If you're interested in playing a combo deck, there are a few that I think are sort of beginner friendly. You can sort of Google, YouTube, whatever, different types of combo decks. But I think one of the nicest ones to beginners is probably Dragon Maid. It does have a few combos, but it's another one of those decks that sort of implements a lot of control aspects into its game plan. So basically, all you really need to know is sort of what cards exist in your deck and what they do, and what cards in your hand get you access to those cards. And then the second layer that you need to understand is, how can I access the powerful boss monsters either in my main deck in very rare occasions, or more often than not in the extra deck. In Dragon Maid specifically, it has a lot of very powerful fusion monsters that it wants to go into, but you can also go into things like Hieratic Seal of the Heavenly Spheres, which is a Link 2, which requires dragons. If you can do that, you can sort of take advantage of some of the sort of resource recurring power of the Dragon Maid engine and sort of set up a seal, but also have the ability to fusion summon on your opponent's turn and go into some powerful plays that way. That deck is really nice because you can sort of upgrade it over time and start to build towards building more of a more pure Dragon Link style type of deck, which Dragon Link is one of the most powerful decks in the game and has been for years. So having that sort of be your baseline is really good. I will say that there are some decks that I think the skill ceiling is a little too high. I think that a lot of people recommend Salamangreat as a starter deck, but that deck has a lot of sort of resource management involved combined with combo. It's the type of deck that is both a combo and a control deck, but it takes advantage of being a combo deck in a way that's really difficult for beginners to understand, and the combos require knowing things that are not necessarily obvious to you at first. And the control aspects of it require you to know when to activate interaction in a way that beginners are just not going to be able to understand as fully as someone who's played the deck a bunch and knows what the current best decks do. So, having said all that, there's a lot of options that you can go with. I would say just, Google a deck, pick it up, maybe watch a combo video, watch somebody execute a combo if a combo deck is what you're interested in, and just sort of figure it out from there. The nice thing about Salamangreat specifically is that pretty much every hand does the same combo. So you're not really inhibited in that way, in the sense that, like, you have to sort of figure out what the cards in your hand can do and then do the combo. Salamangreat aims to sort of end on the same board every single time and then adds follow up back to your hand and then aims to do that combo again every single turn. So that's sort of where things stand with that. You need to figure out, do I want to play a control deck, which I would highly recommend if you're new to the game. Pick up a deck that just plays a ton of trap cards and go from there. Or do you want to play a combo deck? Which, if you do want to play a combo deck, there are some recommendations. If Dragon Maid doesn't really stand out to you, we can sort of have a dialogue in the comments, try and figure out what type of decks you played maybe in another card game that you might have played, what play style you enjoy. Having said all of that, there's a couple things that you also need to keep in mind. One of the things that the tutorial does not do a very good job of is preparing new players for hand traps. So in Yu-Gi-Oh!, I imagine you probably watched the anime. You probably played a little bit as a kid. So I'm going to try to relate this to things that make sense from the olden days. If you can remember Karibo, the card that Yugi used in the anime, it has the effect where when you're about to take damage, you can discard it and make it where you don't take damage. That is a hand trap, okay? The name sort of implies that it's supposed to be like a trap card, but you activate it from your hand. Ultimately, that's a bit of a misnomer. The idea is that you have cards that exist in the hand in a place where your opponent doesn't know if you have them or what you have. If you have a trap card, you have to set it, and therefore your opponent knows, oh, they have a card that they set. That's probably something that they want to be able to activate on my turn to interrupt me. Whereas with hand traps, you could draw your hand, and if you have a hand left over at the end of your turn, your opponent doesn't know, oh, are those just cards that they couldn't activate because they had to manage their once per turns? Or is that like 2 extra hand traps I have to think about? Hand traps exist in a space of card design where they're basically meant to sort of curb the ability of decks to sort of build an extremely powerful board on turn 1. The idea is that it gives you the ability to interact with your opponent on their turn. I can't remember the name of it, but there is a card in Magic that does it as well. I forget what it's called. Maybe if I'm not lazy, I'll put it up here. But in Yu-Gi-Oh!, hand traps sort of busts down into like 3 basic categories. There's sort of the battle related ones, which are almost never good. There's the ones that interact with effects being activated, and then there's the ones that sort of function as a floodgate. So the battle ones is sort of where Karibo falls in. There's also cards like Battle Fader, Swift Scarecrow, stuff like that you can play. If you're playing a stall deck that aims to try and stall the opponent out, like a Exodia style deck, then those cards are usually pretty decent. In the second category, you have sort of the effects that aim to sort of interact with effect activations or interact with your opponent after they've met a certain condition. The most common one is Ash Blossom. I'll throw it up on the screen. There's other ones. There's this whole suite of them called the Ghost Girls. There's Ash, there's Ogre, there's Belle, a bunch of other ones. And they sort of aim to give you the ability to negate things that your opponent does and make it where even if it's your opponent's turn and they're doing something that's unfair, you have the ability to sort of play on their turn a little bit. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. You have to constantly be aware of the fact that your opponent could at any point activate a hand trap. That's really important to keep in mind. And sort of the flagship hand trap that isn't really a negation or activates off of a monster effect, but does require your opponent to reach a certain condition is Nibiru. After your opponent has summoned 5 times, you contribute everything on the field. Summon Nibiru to your side of the field and a token to their side of the field, and the attack and defense of the token is the combined attack of everything that was tributed. So that card's really strong. It's one of those cards where it sort of warped the format and made it where if a deck can't put up a negate within the first 5 summons, then it sort of hard loses to Nibiru and probably isn't going to see a lot of play. Ash Blossom is another one of those cards that sort of polarizes the format. Decks that can't play through Ash probably aren't going to be very good, but there are cards that have been printed to sort of counter Ash, things like Called by the Grave, which allow you to banish a monster from your opponent's graveyard and then negate its effects and all other effects of the same name until the next turn. That card is very much meant to sort of counteract hand traps, specifically stuff like Ash Blossom or Ghost Ogre. So if your deck has a hard time playing through Ash or any other hand trap for that matter, you should definitely play Called by the Grave. They also printed Crossout Designator, which is sort of supposed to be a more balanced version of Called by the Grave, because what it does is it allows you to sort of banish a card from your deck and then negate the effects of that card on the field or whatever for the rest of the turn. So if your opponent ashes you and you play Ash in your deck, you can activate Crossout, call Ash, and then you banish an Ash from your deck and their Ash gets negated, so you don't have to worry about Ash negating your things. But that brings me to the third type. And I say floodgate. Let me sort of explain what that means. A floodgate effect is an effect that sort of just applies to the whole game. It can apply to the field, it can apply to the grave, it can apply to just a player. But what it does is it changes the way the game is played, or it puts a restriction on one or both players. The most common one is probably Droll and Lockbird. Once your opponent activates an effect that they draw or add a card from their deck to their hand, you can activate Droll and Lockbird, and it basically makes it where neither player can draw or add cards. And some decks just can't play through that. But the floodgate, I call it a floodgate, but some people would argue with me whether or not I should call it a floodgate. And that's Max C. And Max C is not legal in the TCG. It's not legal here in North America, Europe, Central South America, stuff like that, Australia. But it is legal in Japan, the OCG, and it's legal in Master Duel. And the fact that it's legal in Master Duel has completely warped the format to the point where in formats where Ash Blossom shouldn't be good, Ash still sees huge amounts of play because it counters Max C. So Max C is really strong. It says that after you've activated it, every time your opponent special summons, you get to draw a card. This card can sometimes make it where people just have to pass their turn. And the whole reason why this card is so good is the existence of things like hand traps and the ability of people to sort of draw a lot of cards if their opponent decides to play it. Now, Max C creates a weird scenario where you sort of have to play as many outs to Max C as you can. So because of that, Ash sees a ton of play. Because of the fact that Max C causes you to draw, you can Ash it. You also see that Call by the Grave sees a lot of play because it can counter Max C, and Crossout Designator sees a lot of play because it also can counter Max C. So that sort of is the big barrier to entry for a lot of people, is sort of the existence of hand traps. And understanding what hand traps are good and what hand traps are worthwhile is honestly a little difficult. I think that in general, Ash Blossom is probably the most generic of any of the hand traps in terms of just like the ones that sort of have that, singular activation and then you stop an action or something like that. Some other ones to consider are things like Ghost Ogre, things like Ghost Bell. So that's sort of where you have to, consider things. There's a lot of hand traps. If you sort of download a list from maybe like Master Duel Meta, or you see a list on YouTube and you see cards that are hand traps and you wonder why are these cards in the deck, or you think I should probably take these out, I don't really like the way they work. Unfortunately, that's just sort of the name of the game. But there is an alternative. Now, the nice thing about hand traps is that they sort of allow you to play on your opponent's turn. But, sometimes you don't want to do that. What you can do, alternatively, is you can sort of let your opponent play and then activate cards that just sort of break their board. And there's a lot of board breakers. The most powerful one is Dark Ruler No More. This card negates everything your opponent controls, and it can't be responded to by monster effects, meaning that if your opponent ends on like 4 or 5 monster negates, then they can't do anything about it. In the similar vein, there's Forbidden Droplet, which does not limit the amount of damage you can do like Dark Ruler No More does, but it requires you to send cards from your hand to the grave in order to negate things, and it makes it where your opponent can't respond with the same things that were sent. So if you send a monster, they can't respond with monsters. If you send a spell, they can't respond with spells, etc. These two are sort of how you negate your opponent's board. Now, if you want to figure out how to get rid of it, you have the old mainstays. You have Dark Hole, you have Raigeki. Those two are legal in Master Duel. In the TCG, they're both at 3. I believe in Master Duel, they're still semi-limited or limited, maybe. I don't remember. But you also have mass removal in the form of Lightning Storm, which is sort of an updated version of Raigeki. But the nice thing about Lightning Storm is that it's modular, where it can either destroy monsters or it can destroy spells and traps, which makes it a little better. in a lot of scenarios, but it makes it where it only destroys attack position monsters. So if your opponent summons in defense and plays around Lightning Storm, it's not as good. In the same vein as like Dark Hole Raigeki, you have evenly matched, which you have to control no cards. You can activate it from your hand. You have to go to battle phase, which means you can't use your battle phase if you use evenly matched, but it requires your opponent to banish cards they control face down until they control the same amount as you. And if you've activated it from your hand, that means they have to banish down to 1. And if they don't have a way to negate it, a lot of times this can just absolutely destroy an opponent's board. If you Dark Ruler and then activate evenly matched, like, you functionally win the game. But typically when people put cards like this in their deck, if they put a lot of them and they choose not to play a lot of hand traps, typically you're playing a deck that wants to go second. So if you decide to build a deck and you replace all the hand traps with going second staples and board breakers, then you're probably looking at playing more of a going second deck, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Control decks can play these cards regardless, and a lot of times they're fine. Especially a card like Evenly Matched. Some control decks really want to play Evenly Matched, especially decks that have effects that sort of benefit from activating trap cards. Those decks are great. So, all in all, let's sort of run down the list of things, right? Figure out what type of deck you want to play, combo or control. Find a deck that fits your play style. Download a list. Go start playing it. Bear in mind, the one big thing that the game does not prepare you for is hand traps. Keep those in mind. Understand what they do, why they do it. Going second, board breakers. And ultimately, don't be afraid to ask people for help. Don't be afraid to go online, either go on Reddit, go on Twitter, whatever, find a Facebook group, ask some people for help. Because ultimately, one of the big upsides of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the social aspect. If you're just sitting in your room playing Master Duel by yourself, you're missing out on a huge opportunity. Especially if you're interested in playing it in paper. Like, you can pick up some pretty good decks for real cheap. Go to a local game store near you and just start jamming some games. It doesn't have to be official tournaments. Find, a Facebook group, find people that live near you, start playing the game. But if your interest lies solely in Master Duel, find a subreddit, find a Facebook group, find a Discord server, start talking to people, get things going, watch some YouTube videos, learn. That's how you're going to learn how to play this game, because ultimately the learning curve on this game is very steep, and that's something that Konami has been having a hard time with for a long time. If you want to go back through my videos, you can find one where I talk about sort of a memo that was put out where Konami was talking to their stakeholders, and that was one of the things that came up, was the fact that Master Duel isn't really converting new players to the TCG, and it doesn't seem like it's gonna get any better. If you go watch a lot of the videos from like Sykkuno, Ludwig, they're not exactly playing the game in a way that seems very conducive to playing at a competitive level eventually. Sykkuno is at least learning more. Team Sam did a good job of teaching him how to play Sword Soul, which is one of those decks that's just going to be good forever. But, if you're interested, find some people, make some friends, and just have a grand old time. And if you're not interested in talking to people, I get that too. You can still play Yu-Gi-Oh! You can still just go look at YouTube videos, read some Reddit threads, maybe go on Facebook and see if somebody already posted a question you have and maybe other people already answered it for them, and just read through it, figure things out. And then once you feel comfortable enough, go to the ranked ladder. Try and climb your way to Diamond, climb your way up the ranks, and get good at this game. Because, as much as people say that this game is like one of the most difficult card games to play, once you learn how to play it, once you've figured out what it takes to be good, it's a very rewarding experience, and it's very skill testing. So, I hope that this has encouraged somebody to go out there and try things out. I hope that this video sort of gave you a bit of a sort of primer on what to expect. And, I'll see you guys in the next one. Do not forget to subscribe.